Hi, I'm Mrs. Roberts. Today we're doing AP Psychology 12.4. Question 1. The set of emotion-based psychological disorders called mood disorders involves symptoms of blank. All right, this question is about just basic knowledge of what mood disorders are and what their symptoms are. They are emotion-based disorders. The symptoms are extreme or inappropriate emotions. There's a high co-occurrence involving anxiety and mood disorders, and about half of all depressed people are also experiencing an anxiety disorder. So whenever we look through here, if anxiety and depression are both kind of parts of mood disorders, we're going to go with C, anxiety and depression. Number 2, Odette is nearing her 70th birthday. Over the last year, she has suffered a loss of appetite and began to experience difficulty sleeping. She's lost interest in her favorite pastimes, gardening and bridge. Odette is most likely to be diagnosed as having blank. All right, this question is trying to get you to understand, and we've got a couple of questions coming up here with scenarios. The difference between things like major depressive disorder, seasonal affective disorder, uh, dysthymia, those are choices, Alzheimer's, bipolar disorder, that kind of thing. So let's start with major depressive disorder. So emotionally, it's when you have sadness, hopelessness, anxiety, and cognitively, you have negative emotions about yourself and your future. You might lose motivation. You might lose your appetite. You might lack energy. So, all of those examples are all under what Odette is experiencing. So, we're going to go with major depressive disorder here. We're going to try to understand why it's not dysthymia and bipolar disorder when we get to question number 3. So, Molly is now 35. She started therapy because she feels down in the dumps. While in therapy, she realizes she's felt this way most of her life. All right, so what's the difference between major depressive disorder, seasonal affective disorder, and dysthymia? So, major depressive disorder is this intense depressed state. It leaves people unable to function, like Odette here. Dysthymia is a less intense form of depression, and it has less dramatic effects on your occupational functioning, but it's chronic and longer lasting. Right, so it can occur for years on end and have some intervals of normal mood, but they never last very long. So a lot of times, people who have dysthymia, you can possibly get misdiagnosed with this if you just sort of have a personality that has kind of a negative outlook. Sometimes this can also get confused if you're self-diagnosing with learned helplessness, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. So this answer here is dysthymia. Let's move on to our next example, Jay, who has periods of elevated mood to the point of extreme euphoria and optimism that are followed by periods of depression. So we're looking for an answer of something. If you just use your kind of words, the word bi means two, right? So this is bipolar disorder. Let's talk about that for a second. Bipolar disorder is an alternating disorder. So you alternate between periods of mania and periods of depression. So we've already talked about depression, but mania, your mood is euphoric. Your cognitions, like your thoughts, are grandiose, like I can do anything. You really don't see any limits to what you can accomplish. You don't really consider negative consequences. Sometimes you appear hyperactive, irritable, aggressive. You can be rapid speech. You don't feel like you need to sleep. So that's bipolar disorder, right? We'll talk about that more in class. Number 5, people who suffer from major depression often have very low levels of which neurotransmitter. So this is sort of a review from our earlier unit about brain activity and neurotransmitters. So we're looking for one of these that kind of involves happiness. So we've got 2 that are really obvious, so serotonin and endorphins. So both of those 2. So now we've got to just have the knowledge. So the important one that we're looking for here is serotonin. And when we get to the treatment section, we're going to talk about how some drugs, in the biological approach, how some drugs try to mess with how much serotonin is being given off by your brain or being transmitted in your brain. All right, number 6, which of the following statements concerning depression and attributional patterns is true? All right, so we're trying to figure out, how do people attribute behaviors and things that happen in their life? What do they attribute it to? So that's what that is talking about. What we know is that there's 2 concepts that I asked you to learn about: Aaron Beck's depressive cognitive triad, and then Aaron Beck's depressive attributional pattern. So in the cognitive triad, depressed people victimize themselves through their own beliefs. They feel defective, worthless, inadequate. And so basically, it's this depressive cognitive triad where you have negative thoughts about the world, yourself, and the future. And so you just kind of, it pops into your consciousness automatically, and then it sort of kind of continues to cycle all over, like, oh, I feel depressed about the outlook of myself and the world and my future. And so you just really can't get out of that loop. We get to the other one, depressive attributional pattern. And so this is how you attribute success, positive events, and what you attribute negative events to. So for a depressed, person, according to this Aaron Beck model, you are going to take any positive, successful experience you have and say it's because of something that I can't control, something outside of yourself. But if you think about what's happening negatively, you're always going to blame yourself. So, people who tend to make internal, global, and stable attributions for bad events are more likely to be depressed. So that's how he words that. So what we're doing is when we narrow these choices down, we're going to notice that both B and E kind of say the same thing. So people who tend to make internal, specific, unstable attributions when good things happen, and then most people who are depressed will take personal credit for good outcomes. These are saying the same thing, and they're both saying the incorrect thing, the opposite of what's actually true for this disorder. And then we go here, research shows that attributional patterns are most likely related to environment. That really doesn't have anything to do with attribution, like how are you attributing things. And then we go lastly to D, depressed people take on self-enhancing patterns of attribution to maintain your sense of self-worth. Well, when you're depressed, you're not feeling a good sense of self-worth. So the answer is C. All right, we go to 7. Due to unfortunate circumstances, Sally experienced many negative events growing up and was unable to control or change most of them, right? You're a child, you can't do that. Because of her past, Sally presently expects bad things to happen. And even though she is capable of making a difference, she assumes there's nothing she can do to change her life. This best demonstrates the assumed cognitive mechanisms involved in blank. All right, we said we would talk about learned helplessness, and that's the answer to this choice here. That's D. So let's define it. Depression occurs when people expect that bad events will occur and that there's nothing you can do to prevent it. So do you see how this also plays into that attributional pattern from the earlier question? So people with negative attribution tend to believe they are helpless, hopeless. Your negative defects will render you helpless to avoid negative events. Everything is your fault. You can't change yourself. So that's called learned helplessness. And that learned there is because you have a history, in this case, kind of an environmental factor of having experienced bad things and feeling like you couldn't really change them. All right, number 8, women in the US have a higher rate of depression than do men. What kind of psychologist would be most likely to explain this higher incidence in terms of the pressures and prejudices that women suffer? Okay, so what we're looking for, again, we're always looking for these keywords. So pressures and prejudices. So that's something, prejudice is something that society puts on you, right? Pressures, same thing. The right answer to this is sociocultural. Now, we don't hear anything about your thoughts or about kind of self-worth and your ability to control things. We don't really hear anything. Again, when we think of behavioral, we should always think of stimulus and response up here. And in psychoanalytic, we don't hear anything about the ego, the id. We don't hear anything about childhood trauma, that kind of stuff. So the right answer, again, B, sociocultural. All right, good luck studying, and thank you today.